Hello, this is Gary Moore of Glendale Community College. This screencast is for my CIS 150 Summer 17 online class. And in this class, I want to talk about pseudocode and a little bit about flowcharting in relation to a sample set of files I have out there in the week one folder. And this one in particular is called adder.txt. There's also one called adder-wing.py, which I'll talk about in a second also. One of the things that I really wanted to drive home here in this particular screencast is the informality of pseudocode. Pseudocode is no more than a list of instructions that you would give someone that maybe had a recipe that you wanted to share or directions to find a particular location that you would scribble down on a piece of paper. A little more formal than that, and that we type it out in a file, a text file. Typically, I use Notepad++, but you could use Notepad or any number of programs to do this. These are the files that you'll submit to Canvas as part of your assignments. In this particular one, it kind of illustrates some of the main points of pseudocode. Now, for starters, I've got some pound symbols, and that doesn't look too typical, but that is something we use for comments in Python. And I don't care if you use double slashes, which is another common comment character that's used in Java and the C family of languages, but a lot of these have pound symbols in it because I do a lot with Python also. Typically what you always want to do in the beginning of your logic is talk about what file it's going to be stored in, adder.txt, a little description, add two numbers and display. I put the course name and my name also in there, and this is really just kind of archival information that if someone was going to look at it later on would know who created it, for what purpose, and what class. The other comments that I put in here indicate sections of the program. With pseudocode, you typically always have a start statement. You always have an end or exit statement. I also put a comment here, program start or logic start would be just as valid. And then also something here, EOP or end of program. Most of the time when you do design pseudocode, you're going to design it around system theory or an input section, a processing section, and an output section. I put those comments in there to make it very clear as to what these statements that followed would do. I also indented them. I also put some white space between the lines to separate out the code to make it easier to read. Last thing you want to do is give Gary's old eyes a telephone book display where everything is smushed here into the left and it's line after line, and it makes it very difficult for him to read and grade in Canvas. Pseudocode. Anything goes. Input, display, total, print, all of these particular verbs pretty much tell the story. What happens in this particular line 10, input. And whenever you see quotes like that, it's a string literal. It typically displays to the screen. That's kind of a programming convention. That's not something you'd see in a recipe, but it is something that you're probably going to have to do a lot of as a programmer. So if it's in your pseudocode, that's a good thing. This is going to display a prompt, enter number 1. And then what I'm expecting is the keyboard's going to pick up that information and store it into a identifier I've called, or variable, called number 1. That I'm going to display another string literal and then the value of number 1. And then I'm going to do the same thing for number 2. I'm next going to have in the processing section a calculation. And again, anything goes. If I wanted to, I could very easily say total instead of the equals. I could go with an equals sign. That's just as valid. It's up to you how much abbreviations and how much shortening of terms and how verbose you want to make it, but make sure it's easy to read. This simply takes number 1, adds it to number 2, and throws the answer into total. I've chose identifier names that were very explicit to what's happening. Number 1, number 2, and total. You want to make sure your identifier names are in fact going to describe what's going on. If you use things like A and B and Z and K, I don't know what that means a lot of times, whereas num1, num2, and total, even though num1 and num2 is abbreviated, it's fairly clear as to what I'm going to do here. I finally get an output section that's going to display. Again, there's a string literal, and next to it, I'm going to display the answer of my two numbers added together, or a total. Let's look at this second file. Now, this is also in the same folder, okay? And the folder is called Model to Code Example 1, and there's 3 of those in there that would be useful for assignments 1, 2, and 3. This is what the program would look like if I converted it to Python. And I think this will drive home the point how similar Python is to pseudocode. Whenever you see the kind of light blue here, that means it's syntax coloring done by Notepad++ to indicate these are comments. So my start, which was without a comment in the pseudocode, is commented here because there's no such thing as start in Python. The same is true as the end at the end. But some of the statements are very similar. This one changed a little bit. I'll let you look at the change. The only thing that's a little confusing about this one here is, and I should put a comment to explain that, int converts the string number to an integer, which allows me to do math with it. If I leave out, and you can try this yourself, put it in a Python interpreter, take out the word int and run this, and it's probably going to give me an error when I try to add these two numbers together, because what happens is when I have the input method I'm using to collect data from the keyboard, it's going to pop that as text in its value and not a number. So all the int does is convert it to number, then it displays the number and does the same thing with number 2. It does the processing for the calculation identical to the pseudocode, and then finally displays it at the end. So there's a number of these in there. And in fact, if I run this for you, let me do that too. I'll run this in Notepad. Number 1, let's make that a 4, and let's make number 2 a 5, and the answer is 9. So everything looks good there. There's some more files in that folder, one of which is a flowchart, and I'm going to show you that in the next video. If you have any questions, let me know.